I think we're in the worst energy crisis in 50 years. We need a lot more oil and gas. If we don't produce it in the United States, then we're going to do what Biden has been doing, which is to beg the Saudis, beg the Venezuelans to produce that oil. They're not willing to do that necessarily. To some extent they are, but I think it's better to produce it here. I think that the transition away from gas is a very long one. I think it'll take at least a half a century, if not more than a century. Ryan pointed out that I miscalculated some of my numbers on natural gas reserves. It doesn't really change the ultimate issue, because I've always thought that we needed to move away from natural gas to nuclear within this century. I think the best way to move to nuclear is with a green nuclear deal, which is with a standardized design, probably a large light water plant design that we just standardize, and that the US government provides the right incentives for the utilities to deploy. So that's basically my view. I don't know if Ryan and I disagree. I think he was interpreting what I was saying as saying that we should never get off of fossil fuels, which is just not my view. It's never been my view. My views have been laid out on my Substack pieces and on my book, Apocalypse Never. And it's basically that one. It's a transition from energy dilute to energy dense fuels.
Okay, so Ryan, what do you make of that? Where do you differ? Where do you think that the problem is with that?
Right, and so let me be clear that I'm by no means an energy expert. I'm much better at just asking questions about this stuff. And so the question that I have about nuclear and is the scale up, aside from the concerns around the waste and those other things that you could conceivably find some solution to, there seem to be two problems, and I'll lay them both out for you, and I'm curious for your take on them. One is uranium or other raw materials. I guess I understand that there's some hope that we'll be able to create next generation nuclear power plants relying on kind of spent fuel or old waste or other things that have been used in the past. But in general, if we're relying on uranium for it, and if we're depleting our stores of uranium, then it seems like it has the same problem as some of the renewables where you're running out of the things that you need to produce it. So that's the one question. Then the second question would be, in order to power the globe, I think you would need an order of 2,000 or so, new nuclear power plants around the world. And we're building right now, 4 or something? The entire world is building fewer.
No,
fewer
not the entire world. But yeah,
not a handful, a tiny handful. And so
not enough.
And you would also have to build them basically everywhere. And unless kind of nuclear power has evolved in a way since the 70s, 80s, 90s in a significant enough way, you need governments that not just can subsidize, as you said, the creation of these power plants, but they also have to be able to kind of regulate and inspect the power plants. The key thing, they do all of these cultural surveys inside these power plants. Do you feel like they're asking the employees all the time, do you feel like you're working in an environment where if you see some type of safety concern, you can bring that concern forward and it will be dealt with, by management. Because if it's not, you could have, catastrophic problems at these plants. And so when you spin the globe and stop it and point at countries all over the planet, you don't land on a whole lot of them where you're confident that they would be able to effectively kind of build and regulate a nuclear power plant at the scale that we would need to do it, at the speed that we would need to do it. So those are my concerns. But I'm curious on those 2 points what your take is.
Sure. Yeah. So let's take the waste and fuel issue, because they're basically two ends of the same issue. So the great thing about nuclear is that this amount of uranium can give me all the power I need for my entire life. This amount of uranium fuel as a solid fuel rod, it goes through the fissioning process and it comes out the other side and it looks exactly the same. tiny less mass because there's been fission that's released a tiny amount of mass. And then that's the waste. And as an environmentalist, for me, it's solved. It's the best solution because the waste is actually stored at the site of production. All of the nuclear waste produced in the United States over the last 50 years can fit on a single football field stacked 50 feet high. There's no other form of energy production or any other production which internalizes its waste byproduct in the same way. Now you get to the issue of fuel, and I'm working on a new book about nuclear right now, but basically there hasn't really been any serious concern within the scientific or mining communities about uranium supplies since the late 40s, meaning that really we've had abundant uranium reserves. Just to give you a sense of it, it's really been the opposite problem for the uranium mining industry. They haven't had enough demand for their product, and so they've ended up shutting down a bunch of mines. But even if you were to, like thousands of years from now, run out of uranium, we know you can extract uranium from the seawater. They've proven this. We don't know that it's super cost effective now, but you can certainly do it. And it's interesting that Saudi Arabia has actually started a project with China to extract uranium from the seawater. But this gets to the waste issue, which is that the current generation of technology we have only uses about 5% of the energy in this fuel process. And so the vision was always that waste would be recycled. France does that in this really big facility. It's like a mile long. It can take all the used waste and it recycles it. We have enough fuel in our existing waste to power our nuclear plants for 1,000 years. And you might be skeptical because that's the number I gave for the natural gas. But don't take my word for any of it. We can check it out and we can look at it later. But it's plenty of you for recycling. So that's called the fuel cycle. And what happened in the 60s and 70s is that we abandoned the process of recycling uranium for basically two reasons. One was we just had abundant uranium, and it's cheap it's cheaper for almost all materials to just use them fresh from mines and then process them rather than to recycle them. But the other is that there was fears about the plutonium that's created in the process of recycling the waste. And that gets to your other issue, which is that nuclear energy is obviously a dual use technology. Every nuclear reactor in the world could be retrofitted to produce plutonium. And in fact, plutonium is produced in existing nuclear power plants, but they can't go in there and get the plutonium when it's in the process of transmutation from uranium to plutonium because it's too radioactive. But you can look in there and see that it's turning into plutonium. So nuclear is a dual use technology. And so that's led a bunch of people to just feel like we want to get rid of it. The reason that we never were able to is because the political scientists figured this out, is that even if two nuclear armed countries got rid of their nuclear weapons, like the United States and the Soviet Union, if they would go to war, they would instantly reconstruct their weapons. And everyone figured that out right away. So basically, except for a very small number of fairly marginal people, I'm not saying that in an insulting way, but just a very small number of people think you can actually get rid of nuclear weapons. So instead, we have this United Nations governed International Atomic Energy Agency, which inspects every facility in the world. I went and visited a nuclear waste facility in the Netherlands, and there were cameras everywhere. So they're actually filming, and it goes right to Vienna, which is where the IAEA is located. So Ryan, you're definitely correct that you have to have a regime in place to monitor this. So one issue is like, what if...
but not just for weapons, but for safety too, right? I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, and so, on the safety issue, it's a different regime. It's a national regulatory body. In the United States, it's the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. On that, and it's good to have concerns about it, and I don't want to I can't resolve your concerns on this conversation. But for me, what I did is I just went and talked to people at nuclear plants when they weren't at the plant. And was like, how do you know that it's safe? And I got to know some of the plant workers, including people I really respect. Two of them started a group called Mothers for Nuclear, one of whom went into working at the plant, imagining she'd be an Erin Brockovich type who would kind of expose the plant for being dangerous. And she ended up changing her mind. She's very progressive. Her name is Heather Hoff. She'd be a great guest for you guys, Jen. Mothers for Nuclear. These are the two women that started Mothers for Nuclear are like two of my favorite people I've ever met in general, in nuclear for sure, but people of really high integrity, very science-based, very liberal values, I would say. And they reassured me quite a bit. And then and the plant that I'm closest to is Diablo Canyon, which is the plant that Governor Newsom in California just decided to keep operating because we were close to having blackouts, and he didn't want to, we were very close to having blackouts. And also we've changed a lot of minds out here about it. So for me, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has employees at every nuclear plant in the United States. And those employees, those inspectors, are able to go into any room, any broom closet without warning. And you could argue, well, maybe there's some corruption there or something, but their salaries are being paid not by PG&E, but by NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And there's no similarly strict, and it should be strict. But if only there had been regulators like that on the Deepwater Horizon, for example, or at the natural gas pipeline that blew up in South San Francisco, San Bruno, and killed, I think, a half dozen people. So that safety regime in nuclear is super good. And that's one of the benefits of the fears that we've had of nuclear.
Right. But that's the United States. Like, what about Mexico, Central America, South America, Southeast Asia, Africa?
They have to have, most of those countries model their regulatory regimes on the NRC, and IAEA, the United Nations agency, will only work with them if they have that regulatory regime in place. Now, I agree that part of my getting older from when I was a radical youth, when I was a radical youth, I tend to look at the United States as a terrible place, and now I go around the world and I notice how much better our regulatory regimes are, and definitely I think, without putting any countries down or without naming any countries, I do think there's countries out there that do need an improved regulatory system. That being said,
if you want to credit your younger radical self, you could say that it was kind of American imperial dominance of those countries that gutted their social safety nets and their regulatory.
Yeah, and I grew up in the 80s, and so that was when Reagan was supporting some pretty terrible actors in Central America. But what I would say again is that if you look at the regulatory regime of say South Korea or Japan or South Africa or Nigeria, where they want to have nuclear, or India, is it as good as the United States? Without sounding like a prejudiced American, I would say probably not. But is it better than the regulatory regimes in those nations of other industries? I would say definitely. So, and so you kind of go, well, but nuclear, it requires a higher regulatory regime. Yes, and also we got to remember that the worst energy accident in human history was the Banqiao Dam collapse in China, which killed 100,000 people when the dam collapsed. Chernobyl, which was a ridiculous reactor design. The uranium had no containment dome. The uranium, the melted uranium fuel went outside. It was like outside and spewing radioactive particles into the environment. And we saw no increase in any cancers other than thyroid cancer. Obviously, nobody wants any cancers, but if you have to get a cancer, thyroid cancer would be the cancer you'd rather have, because you just replace the thyroid and you take thyroxine, which is the synthetic substitute. So nuclear just turns out to be, yes, these plants, if they melt down, it's chaos and terrible. But even when you have the really bad accidents, you see that it's shocking how few people are harmed by radiation.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.